Hello, hi you guys. Thank you for coming and joining us for our talk today. Today we have Nicholas Macias, who's going to be talking about traversing barriers, exploring crayfish diversity and population structure along Georgia's coastal plain and barrier islands. So one of the reasons why we're doing these expert series talks is for students as well as public or professionals to be able to learn a little bit more about the science that goes around, not just like, in California, but like all around in the United States or in other places as well, to get people a little bit more knowledge on how research is very important as a whole. So before Nicholas presents, I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of background information about him. So Nicholas grew up in a small fishery community in the central coast of California. His father immigrated from Mexico, and his mother has strong agricultural ties to the Central Valley. He got his undergraduate degree in conservation biology from Sacramento State, where he was a student athlete until he suffered a career-ending neck injury. He was fortunate to have has been awarded multiple REUs during his last few years of undergrad, which led him acquiring to his graduate degree from Georgia Southern University. Nicholas' research has focused on freshwater benthic macroinvertebrates, particularly crayfish introductions outside of their native range. He is currently working as the Associate Director for the University of Georgia Marine Institute and has a 10-year-old dog named Mr. Chubbs. Hopefully we get to see Mr. Chubbs on Zoom.
I just put him up. All right. Well, thank you, Anita. We'll go ahead and get this going. Okay. So as Anita mentioned, a little bit of background. I started off as a student athlete, and I really was more of an athlete than I was a student. But following this kind of career-ending injury, I really had to transition from full-time athlete to full-time student, which was a little difficult. I wasn't the best student. But going through the classes that I had taken, I knew that I really enjoyed biology. That being said, I didn't know what facet of biology I wanted to be in. So I was fortunate enough to have a few research experiences that really kind of tailored my focus towards freshwater ecology. But really, what I was interested in was this idea of how these non-native species were kind of impacting their introduced or the environment that they were introduced to. I was an undergrad in Sacramento. For those of you that don't really know, Sacramento is really kind of the focal point of some of the larger rivers in California that are really channelized. They're kind of focused on these levees. And what they were having were these issues of crayfish actually burrowing into the levees, actually weakening their infrastructure, which were causing a lot of damage, especially during flood events. And so I really kind of started focusing on this idea of invasion of ecology, right? So it's kind of the study of these novel species outside of their native range. And so what's interesting about invasion ecology, and something that I was really kind of excited about, is that most of these introductions have occurred relatively recently. When you think about these introductions, most of them are going to be human mediated, but they've also occurred in over a measurable time scale. So you can actually see these changes happen in ecological time. And so because most of the introductions have occurred relatively recently, we can really start to think about a couple of questions, some kind of key questions that we can ask. And it's really, how do these ecosystems respond to these new species? And then again, how do native species adapt to these new introductions? So before we go any further, I really want to clarify two terms. Really, what's the difference between introduced versus invasive? So with that being said, when we talk about introduced species, these are essentially non-native. Okay, they're non-native. They're coming from outside of their native range, but this doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. Okay, sometimes these introduced species can actually increase biodiversity. They pose no threat. And they can also kind of fill some of these ecosystem services and actually be beneficial to the ecosystem which they've been introduced. Now we think about, okay, this kind of more negative term when we think about invasive. And so invasives are non-native, but they actually cause harm. So these non-native species come in, they're well suited to their new environment and can thrive in this new environment, but they can actually start to change things within the ecosystem. They can change community structure. They can cause millions of dollars of damage or $1 million in infrastructure damage and really start to have a huge impact within their introduced range. So there's all species or all non-native species are introduced, but not all of them are invasive. Okay? So I just wanted to clarify those two terms. So some common species that you may hear of, on the news, one of them can be the common carp, which is native to Eurasia. They are pretty well spread around the U.S., causing huge amounts of damage. You hear about carp jumping out of the river, hitting people on boats. They can have a huge, impact on native plant species. So the common carp is widely well spread around the U.S. One that's not as widely spread, but is starting to have an impact down here in the Southeast is the capybara. Native to South America. This is one of the kind of largest rodent species that you'll see, super docile, but they can have huge impacts on native plant species. So the next kind of common species that that I'm going to bring up, maybe a little bit to some of the audience's chagrin, is going to be the domestic cat. Okay, so the domestic cat is native to North Africa, Southwest Asia. It has two ancestral lineages that have essentially evolved to the cat that we have today. Feral cats cause huge impacts to native amphibians, lizards, particularly bird species. And so when you think about the impacts that native or the domestic cat has had, I hate to say it, but it's essentially been worldwide. Okay? So the domestic cat is one of the most invasive species on the planet. So how does an invasion occur? Well, it really involves two processes. Okay? So it involves two processes, one being the dispersal from a donor to recipient site, okay, which are most often than not human mediated. This example here being the cane toad, which is native to South America and Central America. It was brought in as a kind of remediation method for sugarcane to essentially predate on rats. But it is highly established itself, not only in Australia, but also here in the US, in Florida. And so the second process is that these species have to establish a self-sustaining population within that recipient site. So how can they do that? They need to survive, they need to grow, and they need to reproduce. And essentially, they are utilizing the resources left unconsumed by established species. So essentially they come in, they're able to establish themselves, they're able to outcompete for these resources, or to utilize the resources that aren't being utilized. And that's how they're able to essentially establish themselves. So you may be asking yourself, Nick, why are we talking about cats and cane toads? I thought this was a talk about crayfish, right? So let's get cray. So when we talk about crayfish, so scientifically, we think about crayfish as the proper term, but down here in the Southeast, we call them crawdads. Depending on where you are in the Southeast, you might call them mud bugs. But crayfish, essentially, some of the most invasive crayfish are going to be this little guy, Procambarius clarkii, the red swamp crayfish. So when I started off talking about the crayfish that are actually burrowing into levees and having these huge impacts in Sacramento, this is the culprit. So how is this red swamp crayfish that is native to Louisiana, okay, so Louisiana, how is it burrowing into these levees in California? Well, when you think about this little crawdad, there are essentially two ways that crayfish get distributed. And one of them being for culinary purposes. Okay, culinary purposes. This is a southern boil. If folks don't necessarily know what that is, essentially they are delicious. They're delicious to eat, but they are a delicacy, and so they are being farmed around the U.S. in order to meet that demand for this type of cuisine. And so with that, they are essentially bred in these earthen ponds. They're taken out, and there's a market for them. Well, what happens is as these crayfish are built in these or grown in these outdoor ponds, sometimes those ponds get inundated. Crayfish can have essentially traverse the terrestrial plane. So they can go from one water source to another. So they're not necessarily isolated within the area that they're being farmed. So that's one way that they can become introduced outside of their native range. Another is that they are great fish bait. Folks use these as fish around the country, or to catch fish around the country. Essentially, you can go get a bucket of crayfish bait. Now, you've spent all day fishing and you still have 10, 20, 30 crayfish left in your crayfish bucket. What are you going to do with them? You're not going to necessarily take them home because you're done fishing. So what are you going to do? You're just going to dump them out in the nearest water source. And now you've just introduced a non-native species. So crayfish, especially invasive crayfish, can actually displace native species from their natural habitat. And there's a few ways that they can actually do this. So when you think about an invasive species, there are a couple of processes that can happen in order for them to displace these native species. One of them being that they're going to carry disease. Okay, so the fungal plague has actually been a huge issue in Europe, essentially decimating some of the native crayfish populations in Europe, because only native or North American crayfish carry this particular disease. So as they're being brought over for this culinary purpose, they're actually carrying this disease, and through that transmission process, which I just described, they're actually starting to spread that disease to a lot of these native crayfish. Then you can have kind of more of these ecosystem impacts, right? So we start to think about competition and predation. So you can influence these native fish and other macroinvertebrate populations for resources, either directly through predation, right? So now you're just, they're directly consuming on you. or indirectly through competition. So now they're decimating the food resource that you're actually trying to, or some of these native species are actually trying to use. So because they are well suited for that environment, they may actually be higher competitors to those native species. And then finally, you can have hybridization. So when you think about hybridization, now you're just starting to outbreed or start to breed with those native species, because they're that when you talk about species lines, it's kind of blurred when it comes to certain particular species of crayfish. So now you start to have hybridization and you start to breed out native species. So that being said, I really want to kind of transition into some of these experiences that I've had, essentially trying to study these impacts that invasive crayfish may have within their native environment. And so the first one was a study that I did in southeastern Pennsylvania, on the East Coast, for one of my internship projects. But this is really what kind of introduced me to invasion ecology. And it's really interesting on the fact that we started to look at not only a native and invasive crayfish, but we started to think about, okay, what are these crayfish eating? And so if you think about a stream, you have, not only do you have just the stream itself, but you also have the outlying riparian zone. And so if for those of you that aren't really familiar with how energy works through these headwater streams, you have a lot of energy. So you're just thinking about this plant matter that's growing, and then along the side of the stream, and then as that dies, a lot of that plant matter falls into the stream that can then be broken down by organisms within the stream, one of them being crayfish. So I really wanted to look at the growth rate, survivorship, and behavior of a native and invasive crayfish on an invasive plant diet. So when you think about invasive plant diet, not only do you have invasive crayfish within the stream itself, now you have this invasive plant around the riparian zone. And so this invasive plant is actually allelopathic. And so it's Ailanthus altissima. And so the tree of heaven, I'm sure you've all have seen it. It grows really rapidly. It's pretty prevalent around the Northeast, through the Midwest. It's one of the most invasive riparian plants in the US. And when we think about allelopathic, essentially it produces a natural herbicide. And so when you look at these colonies, there's nothing else that can grow underneath it because it's prohibiting that growth based off of its allelopathic properties. So here on the left, we have the rusty crayfish, a highly invasive crayfish coming out of the state of Ohio, that has a very aggressive tendency. It's got these really large claws. And it has essentially displaced a lot of native crayfish around the Midwest and was introduced to southeastern Pennsylvania. Excuse me. Now on the right, you have Cambarus bartonii, a native crayfish. It's a little bit more docile, a little bit more. It's going to have an omnivorous kind of tendencies. But not as aggressive because it really hasn't had to compete. There's not a lot of other native crayfish within these streams, in these study streams. So you have Orconectus rusticus, the rusty crayfish, very aggressive. Then you have Cambarus bartonii, which is going to be more docile. And so what we wanted to look at was how are a native and invasive plant diet going to influence behavior. So we have tulip poplar, no allelic properties, native to southeastern Pennsylvania, grows all over the riparian zone, but it grows within a community structure. Then on the right, you have the tree of heaven, or Ailanthus altissima, the invasive species, which has these allelopathic properties, which are actually going to prohibit anything else from going around it. So we wanted to see, well, how is this really going to impact these crayfish that as the leaves fall into the stream itself, how are they going to impact their behavior? And behavior is really what I'm going to focus on this time, because it's really the most interesting. Because, so how do you study behavior? Well, we really give these crayfish a native and invasive plant diet, and then we do the best thing. We have them fight. And so essentially, I had these crayfish compete for a food resource after giving them this plant diet. I essentially put them in this coliseum and had few metrics looking at whether they were aggressive, where they would crawl towards the food resource, or if there was aggression from the other one, would it be that they would swim away, which would essentially mean more docile. So this was kind of a behavioral study. So as we saw in this kind of pre-feeding, before we gave them the invasive and native plant diet, as you can see, just the average aggression was in the invasive crayfish's favor. Okay, highly significant. There was more aggression of O. rusticus than C. bartonii, which we would expect was more docile. But as we go to post-feeding of the same crayfish, you can see that there was a change in the aggression. So now we actually see that there is a change from the invasive plant diet on the aggressive crayfish that actually reduced aggression, but increased it in the native crayfish. So that was one of the more interesting studies that I conducted, just essentially kind of getting an introduction to this idea of how not only do invasive crayfish interact with native crayfish, but thinking of the stream environment as a whole. So fast forward, I graduate from Sacramento State. I'm trying to figure out what exactly I want to do with my life. And I just know what, I really want to continue studying crayfish. And so from there, I transferred to Georgia Southern University, where I was able to look at the abundance, distribution, and genetic variation of a non-native red claw crayfish, Charax quadricarinatus, which had recently been introduced to Puerto Rico. So when we think about Charax, so again, it is a species that they wanted to, some aquaculture folks in Puerto Rico wanted to study to see how it could be essentially farmed to reduce the kind of demand for native shrimp. This particular species is from northern Australia, and it is an aquaculture species. So it comes from actually two rivers in northern Australia, and went through this huge breeding process in order for it to be considered an aquaculture species. And with that, so it comes from Australia, and it was introduced into Puerto Rico in 1997. It comes from a single shipment of about 3,000 individuals that were imported into northeastern Puerto Rico. It was accidentally released into Louisa River drainage following Hurricane Georges in 1998. So these were, again, they were bred in these earthen ponds that essentially were inundated during this hurricane. So when I talk about inundated, they were just flooded. So now they were just released into the drainage, and they have continued to persist within this particular drainage, the Louisa River drainage system. The only documented movement from this northeastern part from the island was back in 2001, where they had actually taken them down to the southwest, where they wanted to essentially do the same thing to see if they can to grow them for aquaculture as, again, a culinary species. So what I wanted to do for my thesis was really try to understand what the movement was around the island. And so as I kind of tried to figure out what that would be, I picked a distribution of 6 reservoirs and 1 aquaculture farm. So Louisa, so just kind of a note is that when you think about these reservoirs, there's no natural lakes that occur in Puerto Rico. They're all dammed. So you have 6 reservoirs that were 1 representative of the island, and then 1 aquaculture farm where these were actually a pest. And so for this talk, what I'm going to focus on is more of the genetic structure of these crayfish within the island. And so when you think about these various sampling sites, so we tried to get as much representation within the time that we had around the island. If you had kind of tuned in last week or last month, a colleague of mine is actually building on this project, and we have actually increased the amount of sample sites. But for this talk, we're just kind of focusing on what I did for my thesis, and we were able to actually sample from 5 of the 7 sample sites. So when you think about the northeastern part of the island, that's the original introduction event, and then you have essentially a spread of sample sites from around the island. So what we wanted to do was essentially look at what's the genetic structure of these populations, introduced populations. So as I said, is that you want to have, essentially these going from their native population to these introduction sites. But when you think about an introduction, this isn't a lot of individuals. Okay? You can have 1 breeding female that can be distributed in a multitude type of ways. You can have, it can be brought through bait bucket. It can be brought just because some fishermen thought it was 1 species when it's not. It can even get as crazy as a bird taking 1 rabid female and just dropping them in, a spot where she thought that it would be a good roosting site. These introductions have a multitude of possibilities on how they can occur. So when you think about that, the island of Puerto Rico is not very big. It's you can get around the island in about 4 or 5 hours. You can traverse the whole island. But there are the landscape is really characterized by this central mountain range that kind of isolates the ways that you can really get around the island. So really, you can only go around the perimeter, and so that's kind of what we focused on, was kind of more of this these accessible sites that we hypothesized were going to be more kind of these pathways for introductions to occur. So when we're just kind of focusing on the genetic aspect, we wanted to look at genetic diversity. Okay, so we picked essentially 7 alleles. We originally started with 20, but there were only 7 that worked. So we were using 7 microsatellite alleles, and then we wanted to calculate a variety of ways that you can, or metrics that would tell you how much of the populations are actually diverging from each other. For this particular talk, I'm just going to focus on variance among and within populations. And then we're going to kind of focus on isolation by distance, because that's really what the most interesting part is. So when we think about these kind of metrics, we're looking at among and within individuals. So among populations, right, we're really kind of looking at this variance is only about 32%. And then you have, within individuals is roughly about 50% of that variance. And when you think about this statistical analysis, we think about this FST. And this is just really how we're able to see how much of the populations are actually differentiating from each other. Are they all isolated influences, or are they actually isolated introduction events? So this is kind of a way to see, okay, are they moving around the island, or are there just, singular introduction events where these crayfish are not actually moving across? And what we found is that they're actually pretty isolated. And so from that, okay, now we want to ask a greater question. What is the actual, kind of isolation that's occurring? And so now we're able to look at this statistic that's really kind of this isolation by distance. And so when we think about, okay, we're starting to look at these values of these singular introduction events and how they differentiate from these other introduction events. And so pretty much if we look at the statistical analysis, everything else was highly significant. So these are isolated populations. They're not moving around except for Sidra and Oaxaca. And so this was very interesting when it comes to, you think about just isolation by distance. And so if we go back to the map, so Sidra is on one side of the island, and now you have Oaxaca, which is on the complete other side. So this is saying that there is movement. For some reason, these crayfish are moving. They're traversing these large land gaps that are that should be essentially isolated. But Sidra, again, is one of the larger populations on the island. Oaxaca is, again, one of the larger reservoirs. So this really kind of opened up the question of how are these crayfish moving around the island, because we have essentially proven that they are. And so if you had tuned in to my colleagues' talk last month, we're actually expanding on this and seeing how these crayfish are moving around the island. Okay, so now we've talked about invasive crayfish and how they can either be introduced or they can be invasive. So we talked about invasive with the impacts of the rusty crayfish on Cambarus bitonii in northeastern Pennsylvania. Then we talked about introduced crayfish on the island of Puerto Rico. We don't know enough to really decipher between are they invasive or are they introduced, and that is continuing work that's going on. So the title of my talk is Traversing Barriers, right? So we're exploring crayfish diversity and population structure along Georgia's coastal plain and barrier islands. So when we think about, now we're getting into the southeastern part of the United States, okay? And one thing that is really, really interesting when we think about native crayfish in the US, right? 77% of all the world's crayfish occur in North America, right? Which is roughly around 405 species and subspecies. Where do you think most of those occur? 2/3 of those 405 species are endemic to the southeastern part of the US. Okay, that is a huge amount. Okay, I think it's something around like 300, 350, 380 are just in the southeast. That's 6-7 states, okay, occur in the southeastern part of the US. And these are all endemic. They're native here. And so native crayfish are second only to freshwater mussels as the most threatened taxonomic group in North America. Okay, this is coming from development. This is coming from water pollution. This is coming from, these impacts are coming from invasive species. Okay. But out of that knowledge that they are the second, most threatened taxonomic group, the last study that occurred was roughly about 20 years ago since the last distribution study occurred. Okay, so we have no idea what this taxonomic group is actually doing within the southeastern part of the US. Luckily, within that region of the US, there are states that are actually having an uptick in crayfish distribution studies. The Carolinas, Alabama, Mississippi. But down here in the Southeast, Georgia is very lacking. Okay? I don't know what the mentality is, but it is very lacking. So I recently moved back about a year ago. I was in California working and decided to move back out here. I worked for Georgia Southern, my alma mater, as visiting faculty for a little bit, and me and my collaborator started to really think about this disparity on crayfish diversity and what is their distribution. And we started to ask these questions. What's the status of crayfish now since the last paper came out in 2000 something or other, right? Just looking at distribution, the last time or conservation status, the last time they did anything on distribution was in the mid-90s. So there is a lot of disparity on what the crayfish or conservation status is, just boots on the ground, seeing what is there. So this past summer, we had an REU student. So I was fortunate enough to prosper from my research experiences, and we brought in my man Luis, who is native Puerto Rican. He came out, did his REU at Georgia Southern University, and we really started to kind of explore the crayfish species diversity in the lower Ogeechee River Basin. Okay, so we picked roughly about 5 sites, and we really started to understand what that diversity is. And this really comes from funding from the Ogeechee Riverkeeper, who was really interested in one particular species, the Ogeechee River crayfish, where the last documented occurrence was back in 2013. And so up on the northern region, up by the fault line of the Ogeechee River, we were actually able to catch 4 of this particular species. And so this is an ongoing project where hopefully those weren't the only 4 species that continue to exist. But at least we know that they are within the Ogeechee River. So that is one project that has that continues to transpire. As we are continuing to try to understand what the dimensions are of crayfish diversity within Georgia, I'm trying to focus on Georgia's coast and the Barrier Islands, and really trying to focus on one goal of just seeing what's here. Okay? I currently work on Sapelo Island, which is right there in the middle of your screen there. And we actually have 3 documented crayfish that are here on the island. What's really interesting about this particular island is that you can only get here by ferry. So when you think about how have these crayfish persisted, and they're native, okay, they are supposed to be here. So how have they continued to persist? And there also are documentations, if you go down to the south on Jekyll Island, of one of those same species. So how are those species connected? So now we go back to the work that I've done in Puerto Rico and start to ask those same questions, but with these endemic species here on Georgia's coast. And then now that we have understanding of what's on the barrier islands, you can only get to 4 of these islands by ferry. So now this produces a great kind of macrocosm where you can actually look at some of these islands where you can get to by bridge, highly developed. Then you have these more rural islands where we know that, yes, crayfish exist here. How? How are they able to persist? There are no natural rivers or streams. All of this should be saline because we're right on the coast. You have these natural wetlands, yes, that are inundated during hurricanes, but how are we able, or how are these freshwater species able to persist on these barrier islands? And so once we figure out what's on these barrier islands, as we go through and ask the question, what's the difference between these connected islands that are huge or highly developed? They have golf courses, they have these permanent kind of man-made water infrastructure versus these more rural islands that are only inundated during these huge kind of storm events. That's the only fresh water that these islands are able to receive. And so now we can start asking the question is, what's the diversity? 2, what's the connectivity just on the barrier islands? And then 3, what is the connectivity to the mainland? And we can start to see how these crayfish are actually moving throughout the barrier islands to the mainland. Are they being transported by bait? What is the invasive species that are here? So this is kind of the current work that we're asking. So with that, you can continue to follow my work. I am the assistant director for the UGA Marine Institute. This is the website that you can continue to follow my work, look at other research that's happening here on the island and at the Institute. There's a variety of opportunities. Just kind of giving my pitch, Tom. But with that, I'd really like to dedicate this to a good friend of mine who's no longer with us, my man Toasty. And with that, I will take any questions.
Well, thank you, Nick, for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put it on the chat, or you guys could just unmute yourself and just ask Nick directly. Also, in case before anyone logs out, if any of you guys are here from Chloe's class, please let me know on the chat so I can let her know that you are here. So I do have a couple of questions for you, Nick. I did write them down so I wouldn't forget. Okay, so I was kind of curious when you were talking about the crayfish in in Georgia when you did like on the river, when you were trying to see like if you guys found like a particular crayfish within the area. Did you find any other type of crayfish there besides the ones that you guys were targeting?
So on those, on the downstream sample sites, we actually found roughly about 8 other species. They weren't our target species that we were looking for. Luckily, none of them were invasive. That was something that I was very surprised to see, based off of just the development that is continuing to happen. And as far as the widespread kind of usage of these culinary species, which was good to see, but I was also very surprised. So yes, we did find 8 other native that weren't necessarily the target species, but they are more widespread than our target species. So that was kind of the focus of that project.
Okay. I also had another question regarding like the first study that you did with the native and invasive crayfish and the plant as well. How much of that plant diet did you give them? I was just kind of curious if that like affected their behavior. And And did you guys ever look at like the properties of the plants, like looking at how much carbon it had or nitrogen in them to see if that was similar or if it was different on each of those plants?
So it wasn't, so the amount of time didn't allow for more kind of nutrient analysis. This was really kind of based off of the questions that we were asking were kind of based off of the literature. We knew that these plants had allelopathic properties, the invasive, the native. There was no record of any sort of negative effects to other plant communities. But we weren't able to look at any sort of like ash-free dry math to look at any carbon differences or nutrient analysis.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have questions for Nick?
About the Georgia islands. So you said you're looking at 4 of them which are uninhabited, but did you also find crayfish on the islands which were, inhabited by humans, had construction projects on them, or just on the uninhabited island?
So are you saying, have we found any crayfish on the inhabited islands?
Yeah.
Not yet. We are just starting this project. So right now we're just focusing on the uninhabited. But from what I have heard, just off of conversations with people, that yes, there are crayfish on the inhabited islands. What the species are, I couldn't tell you. Not yet. That's the goal.
Any other questions? So PJ put it on the chat. He said, did you notice any common factors in the introductions in your studies in Pennsylvania, PR, and Georgia?
Actually, they were necessarily the only 2 that I've studied as far as introductions were Pennsylvania and PR. And the systems were wildly different. So in PR, I focused more on kind of lentic ecosystems, right? So focusing on reservoirs. There wasn't a lot of flowing water. In PA was more of kind of these headwater streams. So I guess they're not really comparable. But these are 2 species that should be coming from kind of more of these kind of river habitats. And then in Georgia, I'm just excited to see what's out here.
Thank you very much for an informative talk. I don't have any questions, but I've been lucky enough to explore the Georgia salt marshes up the coast, actually one time in the Intercoastal Waterway. Fantastic spot, and happy to hear that you're doing some research down there. It's a beautiful spot to see, and some wonderful ecosystems down there, certainly.
Thank you, Avery.
Okay, so if there isn't any more questions for Nick, thank you all for joining today for this talk. Thank you very much, Nick. I really appreciate it, giving your time. And hopefully we get to see you next month on our next talk, which is going to be on October. Don't want to give you guys the wrong date. October 12th at 7 p.m. Thank you, you guys.
All right. Thank y'all.